But as the day wore on, it became clear that not even Oprah Winfrey would be able to breach the closure of the nation's air traffic. And for 2 more days, Buffett's out-of-town visitors remained stranded. On the 3rd day, Maravitz began making calls and found a rental agency that had a car available. He invited his golfing companions to join him, but Graham held firm. He would wait for Winfrey's plane, he said. But Banks said, "I'm coming with you." And after getting directions from the hotel, the 2 men set off on a trip to Chicago they were told would take about 7 hours. Maravitz and Banks had been friends in Chicago for 30 years. Banks and his 4th wife, Liz, had attended Maravitz's wedding in 1995 to Christy Hefner, the chair and CEO of the Playboy publishing empire, which had been founded by her father. He and Banks had played golf many times, often at Cog Hill, a course 30 miles southwest of Chicago, where Banks had been a regular during his playing days, when it was one of the few clubs where black golfers were welcome, and occasionally they did favors for each other. Banks enjoyed the company of prominent people, and Maravitz, who, along with his political career, was active in Chicago's business real estate market, would often invite him to elite social gatherings. He also brought Banks to Chicago Bulls games. This was during Michael Jordan's heyday, when the Bulls were the hottest ticket in town, and Banks would usually bring a box of baseballs for autograph seekers. He never said no, Maravitz says. The ushers would have to stop them from coming down because it was interrupting other people's view of the game. Banks, in turn, would make personal appearances at Maravitz's request. Somebody would call me and say, "My friend is turning 50 and he's the biggest Cub fan in Chicago. Could Ernie Banks come by his birthday party just for a few minutes and sign a ball and say hello?" Maravitz says. Banks was invariably accommodating and often stayed longer than the promised time. Banks had a photographic memory and often surprised people he had run into years earlier when he greeted them by name and inquired about their wives and children, whose names he remembered too. In 1996, Maravitz bought a building on Chicago's near North Side that housed a museum dedicated to Al Capone, which he planned to turn into a sports bar. The city's mayor, Richard M. Daley, detested the presence of the museum, as did its Italian community, which considered it a civic insult. "I still have a union card, so if they need someone to operate the wrecking ball, I hereby volunteer," Dominic DeFrisco of the Joint Civic Committee of Italian Americans told Gene Siskel, the movie critic for the Chicago Tribune. Maravitz had a better idea. He invited Banks to join him on the sidewalk in front of the museum and handed him a baseball bat. As the television cameras rolled, Banks began the destruction of the museum with a home run swing through one of its windows. But despite Banks' constant public display of good cheer, Maravitz and others who knew him well were aware of another, more complicated side of his personality. Upon meeting people, Banks would always ask a question and then follow up with more. Only later would those talking to him realize he had not said a single word about himself. He'd ask me, "How's Judge Abe?" Maravitz says, referring to his uncle, Abraham Lincoln Maravitz, who was a legend in Chicago's legal circles, or, "How's the new restaurant doing? Are you going to run for office? Have you seen the mayor lately?" Over the years, the people closest to Banks had learned that these questions, and especially his 2 best-known greetings, "Are you married?" and "How's your wife?" were a defense mechanism. As long as he was asking questions, he didn't have to answer them. People who spend time among professional athletes marveled at this because the favorite subject of so many of them is themselves. They revel in talking about the obstacles they overcame, the achievements no one fully appreciated, the slights they endured, the managers, executives, and media who did them wrong. But Banks was at the other end of the spectrum. He was widely hailed as baseball